right, thank you so much to our speakers for that panel discussion, and so sorry again for the delay, but we are up and running. Up next, we have our first pre-recorded session. So if you do have any questions for this speaker, you can still pop them into the chat and we will pass them off. But this session is called Security by Design, Guiding Force for Securing the Foundation. And the speaker for this session is Rohini Nara, Security Architect and Expert from Mercedes-Benz Innovation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on Security by Design, Guiding Force for Securing the Foundation. Agenda of today's presentation would be to look at some of the examples or consequences of neglecting the requirement and design phase of the security development lifecycle, what advantages it would bring if you follow them, and how you could easily overcome the challenges that you face as an architect or a developer in implementing those steps. A quick introduction about me. My name is Rohini, and I work as a cybersecurity architect at Mercedes-Benz Tech Innovation, which is located in Ulm, Germany. Yes, so this is a very famous picture from Microsoft. It's the security development life cycle. So today, we would be focusing on the highlighted phases here, requirement and design phase. So under requirement phase, we perform or we establish security requirements at the beginning. We create quality gates or bug gates. We perform security and privacy risk assessment. And under design phase, we establish design requirements. We perform attack surface analysis or reduction. And finally, we perform threat modeling. So this happened back in 2019. Medtronic had to recall their insulin pumps because of a cybersecurity risk. The issue was that they used a wireless radio frequency to communicate between the insulin pump and other devices such as blood glucose meter, glucose sensor, transmitters, and CareLink USB devices. So as a result, because there were no security mechanisms in place, an attacker or a hacker could intercept the communication and then modify packets in such a way that they could change the insulin settings or pump more insulin into the patient, causing potentially death to the patient. So this looks like a design flaw. So this happened back in 2015, where two researchers, Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek, they posted a video of them remotely hacking Jeep Cherokee. So because these vulnerabilities were found, or design flaws were found in the head units, and several other cars from other different manufacturers were also using this. For example, in the second picture, you see that the Fiat Chrysler had to recall 1.4 million hackable vehicles. So here the issue was there were several issues. So some issues were, for example, the head unit would allow software update via USB without really cryptographically checking whether the software is authentic, coming from an authentic source, and so on. So the only check that they had put was an ISO verification that could be easily bypassed. And also the head units would allow or had support for the Wi-Fi and cellular interface, which the attackers used as an entry vector to enter the head unit. And then they found an open port for dbus over IP. And using this, they could send further messages to other components inside head unit, thereby remotely controlling maybe the volume knob or air conditioning and so on. So which all look like design flaws. So what exactly is security by design? So this security by design principle focuses on making the architecture robust and secure against cybersecurity attacks. It provides guidelines for secure development of products and helps in managing cybersecurity risks early. So this is very important to avoid blunders like we saw in the previous two examples. Let's look at the first step under the requirements phase, that is establishing security requirements. What exactly you do in this step? You identify assets that need to be protected. So what are all the assets? Assets could be anything like personally identifiable information, cryptographic keys, the messages that you're sending between the components or inside the system, or any intellectual property. Anything could be an asset that you want to protect. Then you identify or create attacker model. Who are all the attackers that would be interesting in attacking exploiting your system? Based on that, you come up with use case, a legitimate user using your system, and a misuse case, like an attacker using your system. Then you come up with or identify all the entry or attack vectors from which an attacker from outside could get into your system. And then finally, you think of mechanisms to protect these assets from these attackers. So then you finally get at least high-level security requirements. You also have several standards that you could use to acquire or to import security requirements. So this is one such standard for consumer IoT. I'm sure there are several other standards you could use. So here I just took a small subset of requirements. For example, for authentication, all IoT device passwords shall be unique per device or defined by user. That means you're not supposed to use hard-coded passwords. Or for integrity, the IoT device should verify its software using secure boot mechanisms. Or the communication channel should be protected using cryptographic means. So these are all high-level requirements, and you could use standards like this to get them. So this is for consumer IoT, or you could also use test frameworks. For example, OWASP has created a mobile app security checklist, which is basically a framework for testing. But from such documents, you could also derive requirements. For example, here it says no sensitive data is written to application log. That looks like a requirement. So no application should log sensitive information, for example, or no sensitive data is exposed via IPC. So you should use a secure IPC to when you're sending or transmitting sensitive information. Or no sensitive data is included in backups generated by mobile operating system, and so on. It's a good source for getting the requirements. And then you have portals like what Android has made. It's an Android developer portal, which provides you app security best practices. And from there, you get not only high-level requirements, you also get design requirements. You get hints on how to implement them. So here it says, for example, enforce secure communication to safeguard data exchanged between apps. You enforce signature-based permission for sharing data between two apps, or you disallow other developers' apps from accessing your app's content providers, or you ask for credentials before showing sensitive information, and so on. So there are several such high-level requirements you could get from such portals. And for automotive, you have UNECA regulation number 155, which you should anyway comply in order to get approval of your vehicle for cybersecurity. And especially in this document, there is an Annex 5, which gives you 69 different attack routes due to 7 different cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities, which also gives you mitigations. So even though it is at a vehicle level, you could also apply it to ECU level. For example, here it says spoofing of messages, for example, V2X during platooning or GNSS messages by impersonation. So the mitigation is the vehicle shall verify authenticity and integrity of messages it receives. So you could easily change the vehicle to any component that you're using. Similarly, in the next mitigation, I see the security controls shall be implemented for storing cryptographic keys, for example, use of hardware security modules. So the UNECE regulation number 155 recommends you to use HSM whenever storing cryptographic key material and so on. So all such requirements, even though they are at a vehicle level, you can easily apply it to ECU level. It's a good source. You anyway have to comply to this to get approval. Similarly, there are like 69 of them. You have several mitigations. For example, these are for software updates, like secure software update procedures shall be employed, which is a good enough security requirement, and you go in the depth in the design requirement. Security controls shall be implemented for storing cryptographic keys, which we already saw earlier, so on and so forth. So once you have established security requirements, then you have to perform security and privacy risk assessment. So for performing this risk assessment, I personally have used two standards or referred to two standards that I could highly recommend. One is the ISO IEC 27005. It provides guidelines for information security risk management used to manage organizations' information security risk. And then you have ISO IEC 21434, which is the cybersecurity CSMS, cybersecurity management system for road vehicles, also provides you methodology to perform threat and risk assessment. Yeah, so let's look at the first standard, ISO IEC 27005. So this picture I got from the standard itself shows that the first you have to establish the context for what you're doing this risk assessment, and then you actually perform risk assessment, which has 3 steps in it: risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation, which we see in the next slide what exactly these are. And then once you perform risk assessment, you decide whether you want to treat the risk or not. And once you treat the risk, you accept it, or you go back and perform the entire thing again. So what exactly is risk identification? You identify the assets, which is always the first step in anything. You identify assets, you identify threats, you identify the controls, that how you want to protect your assets from those threats, identify vulnerabilities, also identify consequences. What would happen if somebody were to exploit these threats and vulnerabilities? And in the risk analysis phase, you try to find out what is the likelihood that someone would exploit this threat or vulnerability. And exactly after identifying consequence, you try to find how high, like what is the impact of this consequence. Yeah, it could be very high, it could be low, it could be medium. And then you try to find the risk, quantitative or qualitative risk, based on the, in this case, it is the qualitative risk, which is based on the likelihood and impact. And then risk evaluation is you establish a criteria to tell, so for example, all the low risks, I would not treat it now, or maybe look at it in the phase 2, and now we only treat high, medium, or very high risk, or something like that. An evaluation criteria you establish, and then you treat them based on the criteria. So under risk treatment, you have risk modification, you try to mitigate the risk somehow. Risk retention is you do nothing, you retain it. Risk avoidance is completely you change the architecture in such a way that the risk is totally avoided. Or risk sharing, you communicate the risk to all the possible stakeholders and then come up with a decision. So it's a good way to perform threat and risk assessment. And then, so for automotive, you have to perform threat and risk assessment, which is also very similar to what we saw in the previous slide. You identify assets, you identify the threat scenario, and then you come up with a risk determination that depends on the attack feasibility and then impact, and then do the risk treatment decision. This is exactly what the ISO 21434 also tells you. And then there are different ways of doing threat and risk assessment. You could use a formula-based method, you could use a model-based method. In formula-based method, you have asset-based, you have vulnerability-based, you have attacker-based, and in model-based, you have graph-based and tree-based. In the asset-based, you have different types of asset-based methodologies. So one is the EVITA method, which is very popular, and the ISO has also used the EVITA method, which is very easy to use and very effective. And then you have vulnerability-based. I'm sure everyone would have used the CVS's methodology. You could as well use that for threat and risk assessment. And you have attacker-based, which, to be honest, I have not used at all. And then you have model-based. So you have actually model-based tools available in the market that you could use to make it easier to perform threat and risk assessment. One such tool is the Medini tool from ANSYS. You could have a look at it. Or you could also use for graph method. There is also Stride from Microsoft. You could use Microsoft's threat modeling tool, which is basically for threat modeling, but threat and risk assessment, threat modeling are quite similar. We'll see how later. So once you perform TARA, you will go back and update your security requirements, because you will identify more requirements from this at this step, and then you go back and add more security requirements based on what you found out here. So this is what I said earlier. The ISO 21434 methodology exactly tells you what to do: asset identification, threat scenario identification, impact rating, attack path analysis, feasibility rating, risk determination, risk treatment decision. And the way it tells is, like, for example, let's say you have to find out the feasibility that this threat would be exploited by an attacker. For that, you could use this EVITA methodology that says what time is needed, or what time is needed to exploit that threat, what expertise is needed, how much knowledge should the attacker already know about the system, what's the window of opportunity he needs to exploit it, and then would the attacker need some specialized equipment, or would he be able to exploit this threat or vulnerability with standard equipment, and so on. With this, you get a rating for attack feasibility. And then for impact, the ISO standard talks about severe, major, moderate, negligible. And then based on that, you can establish a matrix like this and come up with a risk rating. Going back to the impact, so there are not just one, but there are 4 different categories of impact for road users. That is the safety impact, financial, operational, and privacy. So safety impact, here the standard defines what exactly could be considered as severe, what is major, what is moderate, negligible, so on. So financial is, the financial damage leads to catastrophic, either catastrophic consequences that affects the stakeholder, or negligible consequences, and so on. Operational impact talks about the vehicle breaking down or just one small thing not working. And then privacy impact is users' data getting leaked, or personally identifiable information getting leaked, or something getting leaked that is not that relevant, or so on. So based on this, you perform threat and risk assessment for automotive. And once you've done it, and once you've revised your security requirements, the next step, you go to the next phase, that is establishing design requirements. So in this phase, you try to think about what algorithms you want to use, what cryptographic algorithms, what key length, and those should also be according to the, you want to make sure that you're not using an outdated standard. You have to be cryptographically agile as well. So in the future, if something gets deprecated, you start using something that is already, for example, you already think of quantum computing, for example. So you have to be cryptographically agile. You have to think of the key length. So if you say that in the next few years, the length 128-bit key length will not be secure anymore. So you already build your system to start using the next best key length and so on. So you have standards, something like BSI is a German authority that publishes standards, such standards for cryptographic mechanisms. And you also have NIST that gives you such guidelines for crypto standards, which you could have a look and get more details from. So once you establish your design requirements, you perform attack surface analysis or reduction. What exactly is an attack surface? In simple terms, anything that an attacker would be interested in attacking would be attack surface. So this definition, I got it from OWASP cheat sheet for attack surface, and it says here, the sum of all paths for data or commands into and out of the application could be considered attack surface. Code that protects these paths, including resource connection authentication, authorization, data validation, etc., is an attack path. All valuable data, cryptographic keys, intellectual property, personal data, they're all attack surface. And then the code that protects these data are also attack surface. So for example, any code or parsing code that parses, for example, XML data that you receive from outside could be of interest for an attacker to exploit. That could be attack surface. So anything that an attacker wants to exploit or could gain from attacking would be an attack surface. So this list is also compiled by OWASP, which gives you an example attack surface for web applications. So for example, user interface forms, APIs, HTTP headers and cookies, files, databases, and so on. They're all interesting for an attacker. Once you identify the attack surface and try to reduce them, you perform threat modeling. So threat modeling and attack surface analysis they have a little bit tight coupling. That means that in the later phase, when you identify that more attack surfaces has been introduced, you go back and do threat modeling again. For example, here in the verification phase, in the step number 13, you see the conduct attack surface review. You're reviewing it, you found out more attack surface has been introduced, then you go back and do threat modeling. So threat modeling, as I already said, is very similar to threat and risk assessment, but the difference is that during threat and risk assessment, you only have a couple of security requirements and an idea about the concept, and then you write it. But here at this phase, you have established design requirements. You know how the system is going to look. You have more information. Using all that, you perform threat modeling. So the first step is, again, the classic rule. Identify your assets. You create information flow diagram. You have information now to create data flow diagram, information flow diagram. You establish trust boundaries, establish authorization roles, who is supposed to use what with what role, entry points, and then you identify threat agents. Here you identify all the threats, map the threat agents to entry vectors or entry points, draw attack vectors or attack trees, map abuse cases to use cases, redefine attack vectors. And then, as we did during Tara, we also we also perform analysis of the risk. So we come up with the impact and probability for each threat and get a risk for that, a risk value for that. And finally, we determine countermeasures and we mitigate the risk. We identify the risk owners, agree on risk mitigation with risk owners and stakeholders, build your risk treatment strategy, select appropriate controls to mitigate the risk, mitigate or reduce the risk, and periodically also retest it if it has really mitigated or reintroduced. So you have several tools available to help you to perform threat modeling, like the OWASP Python tool, PyTM. There is an open source tool called Threagile, or there is Microsoft Threat Modeling tool, which is a model-based tool, which is very simple, easy to use. For example, this is, I created a sample or an example use case for downloading, firmware upgrades and then it getting installed into the system. So for this, whatever use case I created, the tool automatically generated threats based on how I had created or I had modeled the use case. The tool already created several threats for it and also created priority for this, and how it is interacted, some description, what category it belongs to based on stride. So this tool is based on stride. So with this, it makes using and integrating threat modeling regularly or continuous threat modeling pretty easy, according to me. So with this, we end. I end my presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, and thank you for your attention.